Many years ago, I spent a whole year studying the anatomy and physiology and embryology of the domestic fowl. I'd like to share with you some of the things we learned during that time about what goes on inside the egg as it turns a microscopic dot you can hardly see into a fully grown chick running about outside the egg in 3 weeks, 21 days. And my story I've called The Amazing Hen's Egg because it is amazing, and I've called it God's perfect design because I think we shall see in the end it has to be something that was made by somebody very intelligent. The egg, of course, the hen's egg provides everything for a little embryo to grow in 21 days from a microscopic dot to a chick that can run about and even feed itself quite soon after hatching. Here's mother hen sitting on perhaps 12 eggs, and there's the egg, which in 21 days turns into this little chick. Okay, how does it do it? In many ways, we can liken the hen's egg to a space capsule. Now, the older ones among you may remember in 1969 how President Kennedy in the USA spent a huge sum of money getting an American spacecraft that would go to the moon and land men on the moon. He wanted to get there first. And that space capsule in which they traveled is very similar in many ways to our egg. Here's Buzz Aldrin, the first moonshot pilot, and here's the rocket in which they went up. All this part here is really just propulsion material, the fuel to set it at a very high speed into its orbit around the Earth and off to the moon. But the actual part in which the men were kept, this tiny little thing on top here, that's actually the space capsule, which is like our egg. Okay. After they landed, of course, on the Pacific, they were taken out of the capsule and brought back to safety. Okay. Well, what are the requirements for survival for our astronauts and for our little chick? They need to have a food supply, obviously. In the case of the chick, to get it growing from nothing to a full-grown chick. It needs protection. The astronauts and our little chick need to be protected from damage, particularly from shocks, violent shocks, as the spacecraft accelerates, as our egg rolls about in its nest. Both the men in the capsule and our chick need a breathing system. They must be able to take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. And in both cases, the capsule and the egg, there must be a method of escaping from the capsule at the end of the journey. Let's see how that's all sorted out. And we note before we start that everything has to be inside the sealed capsule at the start of the journey. It's no good the astronauts remembering halfway to the moon they've forgotten their toothbrush. They can't go back. Capsule is sealed. It's the same with our chick and its egg. Everything has to be present on day one if it's going to survive. Let's have a look at the food supply. In the case of the chick, the egg itself is a complete diet, which is why we like it for our own food. It's a very rich supply. The yolk of the egg, the yellow part, provides energy because it's made from oil, provides vitamins and minerals which are essential for the growth of the embryo. Here's a diagram, cross-section of the egg, and there's the yolk itself. The actual embryo grows right on top here. It's labeled blastoderm there. That's where the embryo starts. Okay. Now, the white of the egg, the clear white, is very rich in amino acids and those proteins which are necessary for building up muscles and nerves and skin on our little embryo. Here's the white of the egg surrounding the yolk, as you can see. Now, the shell of the egg remarkably provides calcium salts for making the bones of the chick. The domestic fowl has about 126 bones altogether. They have to be created from scratch inside the shell of the egg in that 3-week period. Well, happily, the actual shell of the egg is made from calcium salts, other salts as well, but mainly calcium salts. And during its development, the embryo produces a membrane which grows out so that it comes to lie just under the shell inside, and it's able to withdraw calcium from the shell to make those precious bones. Now, protection from damage. Of course, the astronauts have got their safety beds where they take off in. Our little chick is contained in a round egg shape. Now, the roundness is quite important because it's very strong. It resists crushing. You can get hold of an egg and push the two ends together quite hard, and it won't break. If the egg was cubical, like an OXO cube, it would be much weaker. It would easily be damaged. But we note also that this egg is not round, but oval. Why is that? Well, when the eggs are laid in a hollow nest, because it's tapered, if it starts to move, it tends to keep rolling inside the nest. If it was round, it could easily drop over the edge of the nest and roll away and get lost. But that taper helps. If you take an egg and roll it across the floor, you'll see it goes in a circle like that. So there's a taper. In some wild birds, of course, the outside of the shell is also brightly coloured or carefully coloured to make it resemble the background on which the nest is made, particularly important for ground nesting birds. Now, the most delicate part of the egg is the little embryo, which is going to grow on top of the yolk. And this yolk of the egg, you wouldn't realise unless you're told, the yolk itself is suspended in a cradle of strings, which are called the chelatse, which are anchored into the two ends of the egg, the small end and the large end, to allow the yolk to move like this inside the shell and to protect it from shock. So another important point there is the yolk of the egg is slightly less dense on top where the embryo is going to grow. So if we take an egg and roll it across the floor and it stops, after a while, the chelatse will rotate and allow the yolk to come. So the embryo is now pointing upwards. Why is that important? Well, because mother hen's sitting there and she's trying to keep it warm. It's nearest to the source of warmth. Isn't that brilliant? Here's the cross-section. There's the yolk. There's the embryo. Here are the chelatse, those anchoring fibres. When you break out your egg into the frying pan, you don't see them until it's too late. There's the embryo growing on top of the yolk, and here are the chelatse in your frying pan, just that fuzz of fibres, which have now become detached from the two ends of the egg, where they once were suspending the yolk to keep it from damage. The outside of the egg actually has a waxy coat on it, which helps to keep out bacteria. Hungry bacteria would love to get inside the egg because it's a very rich food supply, and that helps to keep them out. Inside the egg, the white contains a lysozyme, which is an enzyme that actually destroys any bacteria that do manage to invade the egg. So it's got its own protective system like that. Now, in the case of our astronauts on the way to the moon and our chicken on its way to hatching, both cases it must have a breathing system. It must be able to take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. Now, if the shell of the egg was continuous like concrete, there would be no way the embryo inside could get hold of its oxygen or get rid of its carbon dioxide. But the shell of a hen's egg is penetrated at many points with tiny microscopic pores, P-O-R-E, not the cat's paw, the other sort, P-O-R-E. And when the embryo's membrane comes to lie just underneath the shell, halfway through incubation, it can then pick up oxygen through those pores and get rid of carbon dioxide out through the pores outwards. Isn't that amazing? That embryo, with arteries and veins, comes to lie just under the shell where it allows the embryo to breathe. Here's a picture. There's the embryo itself, and this is the sac called the allantois, which comes to lie just underneath the shell eventually and allows it to breathe. Now, oxygen diffuses inwards through the pores because the oxygen concentration inside is lower than it is on the outside. Carbon dioxide goes out through the pores because the concentration inside the shell is higher than it is in the atmosphere outside. So you get this diffusion through the shell. And as we said before, if there were no pores in the shell, no chick could survive. Okay, lastly, a method of escape. How's the chick going to get out? Without help from outside. You see, the shell of an egg is very strong. When you eat your hard-boiled egg on Sunday morning for breakfast, you have to bash it quite hard with your teaspoon before you break the shell. Now, our chick doesn't have a teaspoon. How's it going to get out of that shell? when, in the case of the astronauts, they were helped from outside. Divers in rafts came along and opened a hatch on the side of the capsule to allow the people inside to get out. But our ship doesn't have anything like that. So this is what happens. On day 18 of incubation, the embryo turns inside the egg so that the beak of the ship is tucked underneath its wing, with the tip of the beak pointing towards the airspace in the large end of the egg. You know, when you have your egg on Sunday morning, you bash the top with a teaspoon, you can see it's quite a hollow there, which is full of air. Okay, that's where we end up on day 18. So here's the chick. It's very cramped inside because it's completely full grown now. There's the leg, there's the head, there's the eye, and there's the tip of the beak underneath its wing, pointing towards the large end of the egg where the air space is. Now, what happens on day 20 is that the muscles on the underside of the neck begin to twitch like this spasmodically. And that makes the beak peck away until it breaks through into that airspace. Now, the moment it breaks through into the airspace, it can breathe with its lungs for the first time. And the old system, which relied on transfusion through the shell, dries up, and it can now breathe much more strongly the oxygen in the airspace with its lungs. Actually, you'll hear the chick beginning to make a cheeping noise, even though the shell is still perfectly intact. And the mother hen can hear the cheeping, and she'll answer back. And that's good because it allows the two to identify each other. So when they eventually emerge, the chicks know which is their mother. Now, on day 21, it's now so strong, it's able to peck much harder, and it breaks through the shell from inside. But it breaks through with the help of the egg tooth. Every chick, during incubation, develops the egg tooth. This part of its beak is quite soft and rubbery, impossible to break the shell with that. But right on the very tip of the beak, every chick hatches out with an egg tooth, and it made much harder material, which enables it to hammer its way through the shell. Isn't that amazing? That egg tooth drops off after a few days and is lost. It's not needed anymore. It's done its job. Now the chick, having broken through the shell, can now turn inside by pushing with its feet, and it pecks and pecks and pecks and pecks until it creates a track all the way around the shell, like us when we open a tin can. Here's a picture. There's the intact egg. There's the chick beginning to peck its track. And here it's got the end of the egg pretty well knocked off, and push with its feet and come out. There's the beak pointing towards the large end. And now it can push off the end of the shell, it can crawl out, the sticky fluff dries out, and it begins to run about. And very soon, as we said, the egg tooth will drop off and it won't be seen anymore. Here's our chick, a bit bedraggled at this point, but soon it's like this fluffy day-old chick with a bright eye. Now, here's something really amazing. That yolk of the egg is actually made of oil. And as those of you who are interested in dieting will know, oil and fat are very rich in energy. During incubation, the chick doesn't need much energy. For the first part, its mother's keeping it warm from above. Doesn't need energy to keep warm. And for the last part, well, the movement it makes is quite small. It's only really been hatching for a few hours then that it actually needs energy. But the moment it comes out of that shell, it needs a lot of energy to fuel it to run about. Well, here's an amazing thing. That yolk of the egg is taken inside the abdomen of the chick just before hatching, and the gap seals over. So now it has a built-in little petrol tank made of oil, a very concentrated source of energy, that allows it to keep running about for 2 or 3 days while it learns to feed it itself. Isn't that amazing? Okay, it's time to consider the implications of our talk. Compare with the space rocket. That moon rocket of President Kennedy was produced by thousands of man-hours of research by the very best brains in the world. And in the time it took to develop the moon rocket, there were years of testing and adjustments and failures and having to reproduce something again and make it get better before they were able to trust the moon rocket sufficiently to put the men inside and send them to the moon. Everything has to be working correctly before the very first flight can get to the moon and back. And of course, there can be errors, and there were errors. Here's a fascinating one, well, sad one actually, the Challenger disaster. Those sections of the moon rocket are made of metal, and the sections are held together by a kind of putty, cement, and the grooves between the bottom section and the next one. And that putty is elastic. It allows a certain amount of movement as the rocket takes off under huge pressure into the air, into the atmosphere. Now, on this particular night, the rocket had been standing and the temperature had dropped and dropped until there was quite a hard frost. And during that frost, the putty between those sections of the rocket hardened. So when it took off, it wasn't flexible anymore. And the sections broke apart and the fuel came out, exploded, and the poor men inside the capsule all died. Nobody had thought of what might happen on a frosty night when the putty would be very cold. Now, if we believe the evolutionists, all this came about by chance. Random mutations and natural selection, they would say, eventually produced this capsule containing every item necessary for survival. But is that good enough? If only one essential amino acid was missing from the egg white, the chick would never grow. There are about 22 amino acids altogether. The chick must have 14. It can make the others itself, but it must have 14 in the eggshell, contained in the eggshell before it starts off. Otherwise, it will never grow. 14 separate amino acids. What if the shell of the egg was a solid layer like concrete without those pores? It could grow fine, but it could never breathe. It would die of suffocation. And even if it got all the way through to hatching, everything complete and grown, ready to go, if there was no egg tooth on the end of its beak, it would never get out of the eggshell. It would die. Everything has to be present in the very first egg, otherwise the whole species will die out in the very first generation. So we ask the question, which is the simpler explanation? Did the egg evolve by itself? Or did somebody design it? It was very intelligent and thought ahead of all the things that might go wrong. And we would say, of course, from the Bible, from Genesis chapter 1, on the 5th day of creation, it says, God created the sea creatures with which the waters swarm, here it is, and every winged bird according to its kind, to fill the skies. And of course, our dear old domestic fowl is a winged bird. God saw a way to allow that winged bird to reproduce itself through the egg. Here's a beautiful picture of a huge swan straining to take off on the surface of a lake. Here's the amazing tail of a peacock with its artificial eyes. Here's a little swallow from the UK, weighing only a few grams. Yet it will fly all the way from England to South Africa in the autumn. And in the spring, it will fly all the way back again to the UK, to the very nest from which it left 6 months ago. Here's a hummingbird, able to suspend itself in the air as it sucks the nectar from a flower. And here, finally, the domestic fowl we've been talking about, the producer of the amazing egg. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that talk. I hope perhaps you'll think about the implications. I've got an amazing design from God. Thank you.